The ACN podcast is made possible thanks to the generosity of our listeners and sponsors, including the Agile Alliance. As a nonprofit membership organization, the Agile Alliance is an excellent resource to help you along your Agile journey. To learn more about the Agile Alliance and our other sponsors, as well as how you can become a sponsor or supporter of our show, please visit acnpodcast.org for more information. And thank you for your support. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Agile Coaching Network. We started this in order to share insights, the things that were taught to us, and to kind of amplify them across the industry, as well as to, just give a place where people, whether or not you're new to Agile, you just started off, just wanting to get some insights on, something you might be stuck with, all the way up to people who've been doing it for a long period of time, but, really want to share. They want to share the information that they've learned. They wanted to give back to the community. I'm joined by a set of co-hosts, Donna, Deanna, Jorg, Hendrik, and also we're going to be joined by Sheila Eckhart and also Sheila McGrath, who are now brand new to our panelist group. I'd like to welcome them specifically because, over the years that we've been doing this, both have been really active in the community. They've been, always adding their voice to the podcast. And I just thought that it would probably be good to just bring them on board to the hosts panel on an ongoing basis. How can you support the ACN? Well, there's a number of different ways. Subscribing to the podcast helps us out. Be sure that when you subscribe, you can also hit the star and the like things. That helps to boost the ratings of the show. Also, you can now join a new online forum that we have that's up underneath the acnpodcast.org. If you go there, you'll find forums and you can join there, keep the conversation going. And then lastly, you could become a member of our community. You go to the same link. And if you don't want to become a member right away, you're still kind of assessing us out, then you can go and just buy us a coffee if you want to. If you're familiar with buy us a coffee system, you can do that. That helps us this is all self-funded. So, the things like paying for the webinar system, paying for the web hosting, all of that stuff. So to kick us off today, I want to talk about communities of practice. And I've been a part of communities of practice. The ACN is a community of practice. I've been a part of the Agile Alliance's community of practice. I've started them within the companies, part of my adoptions that I've done with Agile. And communities were a way, at least for myself, to sort of amplify what we've learned to multiple people. And if you've ever been a part of a good community, the ability to be able to either participate or you can sit there as a lurker, you're building trust and network with others. You're just really, in a lot of regards, you're helping to go address a number of things that you might have within your business. It's either from a personal perspective or from a team perspective. And as you know, most of the work that we do today is in sort of the structured team mode, maybe under a hierarchy that you're working together to go produce some work product, whether that be software or anything else. But you're kind of bound together by team underneath a manager and very formally structured, or you're part of a Scrum team that you're still kind of bound together by a set of working agreements that you've established. Communities of practice and going up into external learning networks, those become more of these informal networks that get put into place either by people who are very excited about some topics, people who are wanting to learn, and I could probably continue down the list of different reasons why they come into existence. One of the things that I find with them, though, the ones that are sort of transactional, meaning that they start off from business needs, they find their way of getting groups of people together and connecting them. And then they eventually do something that I think is kind of a miracle. And if you think about most work that we produce, it starts off in the space of people doing work within a team. They create business results. I think the most effective communities of practice that I've seen is that they also are creating business results as well and amplifying that learning to others within the organization widely, meaning that whatever we learn as we go to produce those results, the knowledge of how we did it gets amplified to the rest of the company so it can also equally scale within the organization as well. So I do think scaling and communities of practice and community networks that are formed up definitely are the key mechanism for when we say we're going to scale an agile adoption within groups. But they do have their challenges. And this is where I want to get the perspective and get the conversation going. Communities are sometimes hard to sustain, meaning that from the potential of when we're forming these things up, I've seen groups of 5 to 10 people get together. Suddenly it grows into a much larger group of people together. They get together and they get past this maturing section, and then suddenly it becomes self-sustaining. Even if a particular steward of that community is not present, the meeting still goes on, and the team continues to work, and the community seems to go off and create structures and new places that they can take the team. But I've also seen that after sort of the honeymoon period of certain communities of practices, they form up, just fall off. Now, the fall off can happen because the problem was solved, which is great, that it served its purpose. But the last component is when it actually slides off because people just lose interest. They lose the excitement associated to it. And so to kick off today's topics, what I would like to talk about is, are communities of practice vital to your agile work? I'd like to understand that from the work that you're doing today within your companies. Are communities of practice vital? Also, how do you grow and sustain them? What types of practices that you use in order to be able to keep them going? A couple other questions within that would be, how do you hold space within your COP? Meaning that if you think about the Agile Coaching Network, we've got moderators, we kind of hold space. We're trying to get people to talk and to communicate and to kind of widen the scope of knowledge. And then lastly, tell us what topics you're working on. That's a bonus question. I'd love to hear what are the things that are top of mind within your internal communities. And I'd love to hear that perspective as well. So with that, Sheila E., do you want to go ahead and first introduce yourself? And then if you want to take a stab at this topic.
Sure. My name is Sheila Eckert, and I have been working in agile ways for longer than I like to admit. And I am a consultant and working as an agile coach with a client right now. I talk about agile all the time. That my husband is sometimes, why does everything go back to agile?
It's all about agile, isn't it?
It is.
So what about communities of practice? What's your view on it?
Well, I belong to quite a few communities of practice, internal, external. So within my consulting company, also within my client, and then external. I personally love them because I am able to share. I am also able to learn, and learning is such a big thing to me within the agile space. I need to learn from what other people have done, what experiments they've done, what has worked, what hasn't worked, and put that into my little toolkit. Growing and sustaining them is sometimes a challenge. I have to say, some of them are easy and some of them have been a little bit more difficult. I do like to keep it interesting, have different topics that we discuss, let people drive the agenda sometimes, because if they feel closer to it, then they tend to be more attentive. And I also like to include people that are outside of that particular practice and to get people interested in different things. I belong to some communities of practice that are not agile. Like they do relate, like experience design and other types of things. There's a technical one that I belong to, technical Java thing, which is not really my forte, but it's really interesting to me. So I join it to learn. The topic I am currently working on is, for one of the COPs, is on the benefits of a future perspective.
Tell us a little bit more about that high level view of it real quick.
The future perspective, we are going to do a open space to talk about how looking back is one thing, but looking forward, and how can you look forward and say, if we did this, what would this look like? How would this make our lives better? So we're going to have an open space with one of the COPs for people to come up with different ideas to discuss on that topic.
Thank you for that. Deanna, one of the things that always sticks out in my brain is that there was a time about, and I hate to say it was a decade ago, but it was about a decade ago. You came to a conference that I was one of the hosts for, and you helped us create an open space. And you were really good about holding space. And so I'm kind of curious from the question perspective, how do you do that? How did you learn to do that? And what are some key things that people should know as they hold space in communities?
That's a really good question. That particular open space was interesting because of its setting. I remember I ended up running up and down stairs in order to do it. So flexibility is really important if you're going to be holding space. And also, I got introduced to it through my interest in just facilitating effective meetings. As a organizational consultant, a lot of work gets done in organizations through meetings, and a lot of time gets wasted there. So I was always interested in how to help good meetings happen, and through that interest, I got introduced to Harrison Owen and the open space community, and then people who had analogous things like Worth Cafe, all these things are things you can look up. And I've always loved working with people in groups. So it was kind of a natural affinity to think about how can this group have the healthiest possible and whatever it is they're trying to produce, the most productive possible time together in a meeting. And some things I've learned about that is that as the space holder or facilitator, which those roles are similar but not exactly the same. One of the things is that you have to be so aware of the power dynamics of having that kind of a leadership role. And so if you really want the groups to do the work, you have to not get in the work. You have to be paying attention to the process that's going on, paying attention to how the relationships are forming or not forming, and where, those are the places where you intervene if, or engage if anything is needed, but not in the actual content or nature of the work that's happening. So in open space, for instance, there's kind of I don't know if it's a written rule or an unwritten rule or just a guideline that if you are the person facilitating, holding space for the open space, you don't attend any of the sessions. You keep your attention on the function of the whole. How is the whole event going? And how can you do small things, pick up coffee cups that got left behind? I mean, if everything from something like that to, do we really need to change where we've hung the marketplace? Can everybody see it? Is it accessible? All of that kind of thing is in the purview of the person holding space. And in the open space community, there's a term called space invaders. And I think it's one of the things that trips us up in Agile is because we have such a value for inclusion that we often don't notice when it's time to exclude. And I saw a great quote yesterday. I wish I could remember. It was on Mastodon. It went by really fast. But it was somebody saying there is a social contract that we make around tolerance and inclusion. But then there are people who do not sign on to that social contract and who do not abide by the rules of that social contract. And those folks, we do not have to tolerate, because they've already set themselves outside of that social contract. So knowing when it's okay to say, you're not the right person to be here and help them move on, or, is a real art that you have to have a really good community of practice or a good community of any kind. You really need to be able to notice when something is happening that is contrary to the health of the group, and figure out what intervention is needed to adjust for that. And sometimes that means inviting people to leave in the best possible way. And it's often difficult for Agilists, because we so much think, oh, we should sort of include and tolerate everybody. But some people aren't there for that. and we have to notice that as quickly as possible and deal with it. I think that's just one of the challenges that we notice when we're trying to hold space in a community of practice.
Which is interesting, because Brian actually posted a question and says, should COPs be largely about learning, or should they also have some authority? And I think what you just kind of mentioned there was sort of the authority component around, the stewardship that you have. And I think maybe Brian's question was more into the scope of corporate authority, being able to go do things within the corporations that you work in. But that just sounded like to me that, you have to embrace, I think, a little bit of what authority that you have of being in that role, I guess.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and in some organizations, there are policies and things around inclusion and tolerance and so on. And so, you may need, if you're internal, you may need to be working with your internal HR folks to understand what those policies are and what they allow, what they don't allow, where you do have permission to intervene if you need to. If something is inhibiting the health and productivity is kind of a weird word here, but the ability of the group to function, if something is inhibiting that, do you have permission to do something about it? And if so, what does that permission look like, and who needs to be notified, and all of those kinds of things have to be clear, because a community of practice has a boundary. And how permeable or not, or impermeable or rigid it is, it's a system like any other system, right? How permeable or rigid that boundary is has to do with the nature of the work that needs to go on there and so on. And so if you're in a community of practice where that's supposedly about learning and learning from each other, and you've got, for instance, not that this has ever happened, someone in the group who wants to take up all the airspace, then you need to have a conversation with that person about, the way you are learning here is keeping everyone else's learning suppressed. And how, and you try to problem solve with that person. And then if you can't, well, then you go to the next step.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Shauna, just to kind of build on what Brian said in his question, do communities of practice, should they be empowered to go change policy within organizations, be able to go create, define best practice, propose structural changes to organizations? Should they be able to work in that space?
Well, I think that that's interesting, because beyond just working communities of practice within organizations, you start seeing even some of these social justice communities start popping up around things like, women in technology, or LGBTQ communities, or Asian American communities, for example. In my last workplace, I started seeing a lot of those sorts of communities start popping up to do just that, right? To start proposing changes within the workplace. I think that they should have absolute authority to bring to leadership things that, the communities or the people who have their feet on the ground are seeing, and raise those things up. Other ways that I've seen communities of practice form are around principles and values. So if the company's principles, values start getting stale, I've seen communities of both leadership, executives, as well as others who want to be involved, start having conversations around values and principles. And so I think that those are all really great opportunities to start changing the overall organization in general.
Those are good points. I'm kind of curious, what's been the best community of practice you've ever been a part of, and why did you stay with it?
Well, I'm going to say that the community of practice that I'm currently in has to be my favorite. We're a group of women who work at all different organizations. I think maybe the common bond is most of them are women that I've worked with in the past. And, we are all solving very common things within our workplace. And we come together because our coaching communities are rather small within our organization. So it gives us a chance to kind of ideate and come together on what we're doing and what's working for us. And sort of also almost have a team to work through those things.
Awesome. That sounds like a pretty good group. Sheila M. come as one of the hosts. Why don't you go ahead and give an introduction to everyone, since it's your first time up as one of the hosts?
Sure. I'm Sheila McGrath. I think I just started out with an Agile mindset before the Agile Manifesto, because when I listen to what people are doing afterwards, a lot of it's like, yeah, I was doing that before. And I got certified as a Scrum Master so that I could explain to my management what I was already doing, because they would say, we know you're not doing waterfall and we know it works, but what is it?
Mm-hmm.
Now, listening to what we're talking about with communities of practice, I was thinking of, everybody's talking about at a high level, at the organizational level. I'm thinking about informal ones that I've been involved in and sometimes instigated, where I've never worked in an ideal world where we had dedicated teams and nobody had to have any cross-functional interactions. So I would make sure that we talked about how we were working in separate teams to make sure that people's expectations to working across teams and with other teams were set so that we were all doing things sort of the same way and all had a common understanding of how we were approaching our goal. And I think that's been very effective, because everybody does things a little differently, but you want to make sure that if you've got somebody that's got to split their time between teams, which is in reality what happens in the world, you want to make sure that they don't have to meet totally different expectations just because it's a different team. So I think that's been something that, thinking back about it, I know that I've been involved in formal centers of excellence and communities of practice and things like that at a higher level. But I think the ones that have really made the biggest difference for the individual teams and within an individual work stream are the ones where we talk about, okay, if I'm managing or acting as the Scrum Master or the product owner or whatever, because I've done different roles on this team, and you're doing it with this other team, and we're all part of the same, it might be a release train, or it might just be we're all part of the same program. Let's make sure that we're being consistent in what we do and making sure that we're not setting different expectations for the same people and not working at cross purposes with each other. And I don't think anybody else has talked about that, but to me, that's a community of practice at the grassroots level.
Which is a good point, because I think that a lot of times, I don't think people feel their empowerment to go set up those groups.
I don't ask permission. I was told a long time ago that it's better to ask forgiveness than to try to get permission.
That's fun.
So I just ask the other people at the same level, would you like to do this? We can do it, informally over a coffee, or in one place, everybody but me smoked. So I said, I'll go out with the smokers and we can talk about it then. But we still got everything. We still managed to get to where we had a common understanding. And eventually we started to have meetings where we'd have a lunch or something. And we eventually told management we were doing it, but not until they'd already seen the results.
So to make it a skunk works project until something of value comes out of it. And I think you bring up a very valuable point, though. I think a lot of times communities of practice don't take credit for the things that they do. And maybe they have a hard time articulating exactly what that value they created for the corporation is. But I think communities of practice should create a scorecard, shouldn't they?
I was going to ask, what type of scorecard are you thinking on that?
Well, it's sort of like collecting, what goodness did we create? Where did it have actual business impact? And I think a lot of communities of practice, even when they go off and they share the information that they do, sort of that, please let me know that whatever I just gave to you was useful in your business group. Send me a note so that we can collect those. That's what I'm thinking.
I think they should even start on a personal level. So they should exchange what they are actually personally taking away and bringing back. Because what I've seen, lots of people don't really see the small things. And if this is not addressed, that actually, I picked up something here, I used it, it works, or actually it inspires more people, or whatever, that is really, really personal, and that generates a lot of energy. So it doesn't need to be even as business oriented as a scorecard. Like multiplying the small things might be extremely helpful. So I've noticed that a lot of people just don't see what impact they have because the feedback isn't coming. So stimulate that, and you have a good chance that this generates sustainability. If what the community of practice is about is really close to the hearts of the people, and it's not about prestige of being part of a hot topic.
Just to kind of expand on that a little bit. So you're saying just don't collect we save $15 billion for doing X because we're now doing this particular methodology. You're saying that also just both the qualitative, quantitative type of assessment, even just stories about how life got better.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. And Jorg, are there other areas around this topic as far as, because I know you've been a member of a number of different communities of practice. What are ways that you've helped to grow and sustain them?
Definitely a lot of things that Diana said is true. So if you're facilitating, you're not the one who is really creating the content and doing the work. That holds everybody back to just rely on you. So get out of the way. But where it's needed, especially where people are new to this openness of the discussions, give them examples how to do it, and then let them do it. And the other thing I've seen, especially in really, let's say, traditional or command and control organizations, give the people a feeling that the space is really there, that there is permission to do that there is time to do this. And don't ask for permission to the upper management. That's exactly the same thing that I can underscore, but protect the people, that they are not torn between, I'm really doing an interesting and valuable thing in that community of practice, but actually my boss thinks that's crap. These things somehow need to be resolved. And that depends a lot on culture, how you do this.
Yeah, I know that certain community groups remain hidden for a long period of time just because of, if management thinks that it doesn't directly write a line of code, it doesn't directly, see that immediate benefit. Sometimes it's works and it's hidden within the business groups.
Yeah.
And that's why I think, go ahead, please.
Yeah, and sometimes this hidden groups really take their strengths out of being something special. And as soon as you expose them too much, then they disintegrate because there's no longer that strong sense of belonging together and making something happen that nobody else can. Then suddenly they are just another group in a lot of groups that they are aware maybe not working really well. So sometimes just letting them stay limited is really a good idea.
Interesting. Shauna, Kate actually asked a question about the differences between an employee resource group versus a community of practice, the ERGs. And typically the ERGs are the ones that get empowered for that diversity, and equity and inclusion types of initiatives in space. Do you think there's a difference between those two types of groups?
I absolutely do think that there are different types of communities. So, that spin up. I was really just trying to draw the parallels. So let's say that we have a community of practice around, I'll be very specific around like code commenting, or around, we want to build a community of practice around how we are doing something, whether it's technical or from a project management standpoint. Typically, the people who are in those communities are the ones who care and the ones that want to talk about it. So the parallels that I was trying to drive is that those groups should be empowered to make changes.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. But one other thing in the contrast too, the internal groups versus external groups. I'm kind of curious from everyone's perspective on this. The reason to go join an external group sometime is because there's not an internal one within my organization. And it almost seems like if I had to think of it in the regards of a franchise kit that could be given out to somebody to say, well, how do I start my own group? How do I be the one to kick this off? Is there any words of advice anyone would like to give to somebody who's wanting to go kick something off, unsure what that franchise kit should look like? Well, what are steps that somebody should take in order to go set one up?
First, I want to say that the external groups, one of the benefits for me is not having that myopic view. Because when you have those external communities, you're getting input from people that may be doing things differently because of the different organizations that everybody is working in. And that is very valuable for your day-to-day to have those different perspectives. In setting up the groups, I have only done that using Meetup. And in some cases, it's in conjunction with other areas, like Women in Agile is its own organization. And if you wanted to create a Women in Agile community of practice, you can go to them and create that, and they work with you. If you create your own, then you're looking at a grassroots, getting all of your contacts and creating some sort of meetup or Eventbrite type thing, which is some of the ways that I've gone about doing those.
Okay. And how do you do that internally to your company? That would you use some companies are restricted from using like external websites. They have to use internal resources.
Yeah, internal is totally different. Like setting it up internal is just a matter of determining what the practices that you want to create that community for. And in the consulting company I work for, we've done several of those, and anybody can set one up and send out emails to invite people to it.
Okay, that makes sense. I think one other thing to add too is I think most people don't know, especially on internal groups, that they just joined a community of practice. Meaning that if you think about the welcoming to something, if you go join, say, the Freemasons, you get to go learn all the secret handshakes and everything else, but you joined, that you've crossed over a threshold and you're now a part of that community. How important is when people join the community? How important is it to actually reach out to them and welcome them in? I'm kind of curious. Deanna, do you have anything on that?
Well, absolutely. If it's an existing community and you're inviting people in, then the obvious next step is to welcome them when they show up. Because if you've got just people wandering around that, don't have any sense of what the values or the intent of the community is. I mean, all of those things need to be made clear. I mean, in some ways, I would look at some of the things. I think many of the things that Ainsley and I talk about in chartering teams in the Liftoff book are good things to do if you're creating an intentional community of practice. what's the vision? Why are we here? What is the thing we want to do together? How will we know if we're successful doing those things together? What kinds of people are we looking for? I mean, do they have particular skills? Are they from a particular background? What are we trying to serve according to whatever the purpose of the group is? Some of those kinds of questions. And then when you start inviting people, absolutely, welcome them in some way. For a meetup group, for most meetup groups, particularly the ones that are all remote, a simple email that says, welcome to the group is probably fine. But for in-person meetups like we used to have in the old days, you'd actually want one of the organizing committee people to go over and say, oh, I haven't seen you here before. Can I introduce you to anyone? What would you like to get out of your involvement here? Those kinds of things. So that people feel like they have something to contribute. I always say, for the communities of practice I'm a part of, I want someone who has something to contribute to the community and something they will benefit from by being part of the community. I think it has to work. You have to have that kind of two-way exchange going on, not to make it transactional, but it's relational. Why are we in relationship together? And some kind of welcoming is certainly a part of building a relationship.
Sure. Thank you for that. Jeff, you had some comments on this.
Yeah, thank you, Ray. So I had a couple of observations for the client that we normally work with in a question. So the observation is we work primarily with a group. It's the provincial government, would be equivalent to state governments in the U.S. And they have it's a fairly large government, and they have these I might even call them tribes for their community of practices. So in the citizen services sector, for example, they have a thing called the Guild. In natural resources, they have a thing called the Lab. And there's a couple of other, I know the justice sector has some or not. And I've been involved with coaching in all of them, and they're all sort of different, but they belong to the same organization. And I wondered, I think, Ray, you in hearing you in the past, you've worked for very large companies like Intel. I wondered if you had this tribalism with the community of practices and how you were able to align them at the top, say, in governance, to make sure that these community of practices aren't competing with each other, but cooperating.
If you think about like microprocessor design, we had a huge Israeli development team and a huge US-based team. And from the start, they were sort of high degrees of competition between both of the groups. And it was kind of interesting to see that when, we were trying to get the methods that we were using in one microprocessor to the other microprocessor team so we can benefit from the knowledge, we did push up against that, even to the point of some cases, secrecy, secret sauces, and other things of sort of one-upmanship. And I think it was until we decided that we needed to kind of break up teams into sort of these smaller community groups to work on a big corporate problem, meaning that we had to start saying that this is a common issue between both teams. We need some people to step up and form a community. In our case, we had these joint engineering teams and other things that were forming up, but they were more community-based than they were formal groups. And until we sponsored those sort of opportunities to those groups, they didn't actually merge together. So, and in some cases, we put bounties on, can we get a group of this formed so that we could be able to do Y? And it seemed to start to pull those teams together because they started to have to work together on something. So that was one way. The other way was, if you think of Agile, I've always thought of Agile as the big tent. There's lots and lots of different smaller segments that it can be broken out into. and people could go have conversations on technical practice. Others can talk about, project management practices and those things. But we still wanted to pull them up together and amplify them larger across the organizations. So we actually set up one sort of stewardship group that was responsible for amplifying what each of the groups were doing and sort of marketing the goodness. And that, I think, also helped to kind of bring together awareness that, hey, you can go join that team over there if you didn't know it existed. That was another way. Does that help?
And just a follow-up question. Did you need somebody from a very senior management to say, hey, you will cooperate?
I think it came more or less, you weren't the cool kid because you weren't participating type of arrangement, because it was powerful enough to have one of our senior leaders stand up and recognize a group of people to say they did X. And that happened to be born from one of those communities of practice. And that immediately, I think, got people to go, hey, I can get recognized too if I got into that space as well. I tended not to, from an authority, thou shall. I don't think that really works. It's not sustainable in any particular way.
So just selling the value of working together rather than, hey, you're going to work together.
Right. And I think that also from leadership reinforcing that on an ongoing basis, and I think we had sort of the some people keeping COPs secret because they're afraid they're going to get squashed. That's a whole different problem that needs to be worked. Versus leadership should be representing their whole org and really looking at what are the things that are gaining value within the company. And so I would probably go find a senior leader and say, hey, can we up the communication in the space?
Yeah, that's where I was going with it. And then I had another question that I found interesting. Somebody mentioned earlier to break down the community of practices into smaller pieces like code comments and probably these self-governed things. So it's kind of a two-part question. One, what I've noticed in these guilds or these things that they're having is that it's dominated by extroverts, but a lot of folks that work in IT are introverts. And it's hard to attract those folks because they don't feel like the psychological safety. And I wondered if anybody had any ideas about how to attract introverts to participate in these groups rather than just be dictated to by, I don't want to group it into us versus them, but I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. Sheila, did you want to respond to that or did you have another comment?
Well, I was thinking about the going back to things like if you're trying to set up a group through Meetup, or if you're joining a group through Meetup that already exists, some of them are set up specifically most of them have an introductory thing that they do at the beginning of each meeting, whether they're virtual or whether they're face-to-face, or some of them are now hybrid. But some of them have specific meetings for people who are interested in the topic, but aren't too sure they're thinking about it. They don't know anything about Agile, for instance, and they want to learn about it. So some of them periodically do a whole series of meetings to give people the basics. Some of them don't. But Sheila Eckert was talking about if you're you can go and set something up. If you're working in a client company, a lot of times you have to create some buzz within the client organization and maybe get permission from, it might be HR because you're not just your direct management. And it may even be some administrative committee that you have to get permission from before you can actually start to have meetings on the premises, even after hours, just because it needs to be something that they're in agreement is a good use of time if you're going beyond just an individual group.
How do we get introverts also helping them to get a voice within these communities?
And one of the ways I had two suggestions that I've seen work. One is to just go around the room or maybe break into smaller groups. They may be intimidated in the larger group, but if you break into smaller working groups and then bring ideas back to the larger group, they may speak up in the smaller group. Another one that I've seen is using games. I've seen a number of different games where the people who admitted they were extroverts, like one that I think was really effective was one where you build something with Legos that describes what you think your project looks like right now. And then it could be anything. And then you talk about why it's like your project or what you're working on. And the introverts admitted that they would not normally have spoken up, but they felt very comfortable talking about the object they had created, where they wouldn't have felt comfortable saying anything that might feel confrontational to other people on the team. So those are ideas if it's just they're intimidated by the larger group, or they don't want it, they're afraid of confrontation.
I think those are good ideas. I think the other thing in that aspect is sort of, you think improv rules, which is start off a session where people have a talking stick or something that they have to pass around and talk about, give their perspective on it, and, do improvisational stuff with it. What that does is since everyone has a turn, it sort of warms up the table a bit. And I've seen that help introverts participating.
Gamification, I've seen work quite a bit. Everybody loves to be part of a game. And not everybody, but a lot of people tend to speak up a lot more in gamified content. The other is liberating structures, and there are several liberating structure facilitation techniques that are meant to bring out the introverts and to get better participation. And I've seen those work a lot.
Eric, what perspective do you have on this?
I was harking back to the burning question in my mind is that how do you do things in an agile modality before you have a COP? And I, in my humble opinion, it's almost resorting to grassroots level in terms of, someone early on said about the agile mindset being a precursor to like agile frameworks, and I totally agree on that. And in my previous experience, spinning up a showcase Scrum team from people that have never done Agile before, but infecting their brains with the neural networks that speak about the events, the roles, and the rules of Scrum, and then getting them to practice it. That way, you have one team that's already following the prescribed ways of doing something more or less as close to true Scrum as possible as a starter, because you want your first showcase team to do things right. And then maybe some neighboring group and product leader / product owner might get interested. Then you start up your second team, and then maybe even some months down the road, you get a third team going, and voila, suddenly you have a community of practice without having uttered a single notion of forming a community. And I found that to work without much pushback from the higher ups, because they were getting value delivered in a more or less spontaneous manner by the people who started loving Agile from 0 to 60 miles per hour in one or 2 or 3 quarters.
Interesting. So, I think you imagine if you ran your Scrum team as a community of practice, meaning that anyone can join or leave at any time that they wished, that would be an interesting experiment to do. I would think you'd probably have healthier Scrum teams personally. Joanne, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, the only thing I was thinking of when you were talking about, how to make it more inclusive for introverts is for your community of practice to have multiple ways to contribute. So like if you're having, regular meetings or whatever, also supporting that with, like a Slack channel or Discord or, some other forum where people can post and talk about the things that are, on top of their mind without having that pressure of speaking in person, maybe if that's something that is nerve-wracking for them.
That's a good point. I like that. I think it kind of harkens back to sort of like the marketplace boards that we would do in open space. Actually, having multiple places where people can participate, I think is good. Last comment, and then we're going to have to wrap the show. Sweta?
I was just thinking if we could talk more about how we can have the people who are, not participative, how can we make them more participating? How can we encourage them to participate? Well, one thing that I noticed was we used the breakout rooms in Zoom, and that helped people to talk more between themselves in smaller groups. And then they would come back to the main room, and one person would represent and talk about what they discussed in smaller rooms. So that was one technique that we used.
Sure. Thank you for that. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation today. Really appreciate everything that everyone has shared. Our next live event is on Friday, March 24th. Please go over to acnpodcast.org. When you subscribe to the Agile Coaching Network on any of the podcast service, please give us a like on there. That helps us to kind of amplify the value to the rest of the organizations that are out there that are looking for Agile help. Would also like to thank all of the co-hosts. Absolutely could not do the show without all of you. Thank you much. The ACN podcast is for educational and informative use only. If you'd like to know more about the ACN community, please come up to acnpodcast.org and support our show.